Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and a big hug to everybody. So lovely to be with you again on this fabulous story. It's 4 parts, and we're just going to go on a lovely roller coaster ride with this lovely story. So I'm hoping you're going to join me because it's a lovely story. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was strange to see my first published novel in my hands. I stared at the book incredulously, feeling incredibly proud of my accomplishments. I had never known this day would come, even though I'd seen the moment over thousands of times in my imagination. My greatest longing in life was to become a published author. But be careful for what you wish for, as this had been one hell of a roller coaster ride that involved many hard falls, knocks and setbacks along the way. Of course I had imagined what this moment would feel like, to hold my own published book in my hand, and there was no feeling in the entire world quite like it, especially when I glanced from the title on the cover to my name on the front of the book. Finally all my hard work had paid off. This was not my first book I'd written, but my 5th. Over the last 5 years, 4 of my 5 books had one by one been rejected by the publishers. Looking back, they had not really been that good. And the first one I was actually embarrassed to have even written, and the 2 following that had been total rubbish. Yet all the hard work and dedication, all the sacrifice, had amounted to this monumental, awe-inspiring moment, when as an artist of my craft, I had finally produced something that I was terribly proud of, and now my book was in print. And as I ran my hand over the cover, I wished with all my heart that my grandfather was here with me now, to share in this celebratory moment, as he would be literally throwing his arms up in the air and saying, "I told you, missy, you could do it! I knew you could!" Before long I'd see my books standing pride of place in bookshops all over the country, or available online for purchase. I'd never felt more self-accomplished and fulfilled in my entire life than I did right now. Even when I was a little girl, I had been drawn to books from an early age. I'd find myself staring wistfully at the covers of books in bookshops and libraries, with wide, mesmerized eyes. I would study the book I'd selected studiously, reading the description on the cover, and if it appealed to me, I would take that book out of the library, or I'd save up all my pocket money to buy it. With every fictional book I read, I would be sucked in, down a vortex into an imaginary world that seemed so much more exciting and exhilarating than the real world we lived in. My parents would have to practically drag me, kicking and screaming, away from the library. Ostensibly, when I walked through those sliding doors that beckoned me into that large, never-ending collection of books, I'd never ever want to walk out of that place again. I was like a kid in a candy store, spoilt for choice, unable to decide which books to take out, which to leave behind. There were, of course, occasions that I would read 3 books all at once, and I wasn't sure which book I would like best. That's why I did it. I even asked my mother once why the stories in books were so much better than the happenings and goings-on in real life, because sometimes my fictional stories swept me away in what I considered to be a much more believable world than my very own life. "That's not necessarily true," my mother had said to me. "Every one of our lives is a story that we're acting out every day. That's why some people write their own autobiographies, don't they? Celebrities do it all the time. On the surface, our stories may appear less exciting than those books we get out from the library or buy at the bookshop, because we're living them, even as we speak. Our lives are more drawn out and in-depth, but a story in a fictional book is much more condensed, and so the drama it embodies has a greater impact on you, which is why stories you get off the shelf are so much more gripping, but it doesn't actually mean that they are." "You're wrong, Mummy," I told her. "Books are much more exciting than the real world." And I really believed that, with a steadfast, ironclad conviction. which was why I read and read as a child with an unquenchable appetite that simply could not be satisfied. By contrast, other children my age fancied going on an adventure ride at a fairground, to Disneyland, the circus perhaps, even a great movie, while I would naturally enjoy those things to a moderate degree, but my greatest pleasure, overriding them all, always involved reading a book. I loved the way the story would take me, away from the humdrum practicalities of everyday life, which might involve laborious household chores, or pitifully boring homework. When I got stuck into a story, I would malleably become the character, having the wonderful, thrilling, sometimes scary ride of a lifetime, surfing on the tumultuous, choppy waves of the author's words, without even getting my feet wet. I mean, what could be better than that? It came as no surprise to my parents that I wanted to become an author one day, from a very early age, as I couldn't have envisaged anything more wonderful than having my own collection of stories in print and having my name proudly staring back at me from the glossy cover. I would get a strange reaction from adults when I told them what I wanted to become. "I want to be an author one day." "An author?" they would say, raising a brow. "Well, that's a first." Most kids wanted to be a fireman, police officers, a school teacher, a doctor, and so my startling proclamations were taken a lot more serious than others, because wanting to be an author is not what every child would normally envisage for themselves. My parents were naturally quick to observe that books pretty much consumed my life, and they were not avid readers themselves, so they couldn't comprehend or remotely relate to my passion. My mother thought I loved books because I was an only child, and that I turned to books to offer me the entertainment a friendship would have provided me, as I didn't have siblings to play with, and my mother felt guilty about this fact. But I never ever got the impression that they wanted to have other children. I had come along as a fortuitous surprise that they gladly welcomed, but certainly no other children were on the horizon of their lives. My parents certainly tried to actively discourage this wild, fanciful idea of mine to become an author, which was not desperately hip at the time. People very much liked their children to follow much more secure careers, where they were guaranteed a fixed, faithful income that would set you up for life. Of course, things have changed a lot these days. "Love," my father would say to me, "being a writer is not what it's cracked up to be. It can be a lonely life. Lots of sacrifice, lots and lots of hard work. You sometimes have to put so much into what you do for so very little return. Some authors don't get paid terribly well. If you're a very good writer, you can make your craft look easy to your readers, when in reality it is anything but. Very often your work is overlooked, underappreciated and underpaid, unless of course you're a best-selling author. And if that is the case, the world could be a very bright place indeed, and the future rather promising. And then again, you're only as good as your last bestseller. The big problem is there are no guarantees in any profession, most especially becoming an author, even a best-selling one. It's a long, hard, tumultuous road, believe me, and not many actually make it. Me and your mother, we'd hate to see that happen to you, love." "Your father's right," my mother would say. "You should listen to him. Even if you were to become an author one day, what if your hard work never got published? Imagine how soul-destroying and disenfranchising that would be for you. You could produce excellent work, and in fact I'm sure you would. But if a publisher didn't like it, it would never be published unless you did it yourself. So much of your self-sacrifice would have amounted to absolutely nothing. And that happens to a lot of aspiring authors, you know. I couldn't think of anything more demoralizing than having your work rejected over and over again as if it's not good enough. It's like constantly receiving a slap in the face. If you want to write for a living, become a journalist for goodness sake, or work for an up-and-coming magazine where your articles will get published." My grandfather was the very opposite. He told me all the reasons I should. We all need someone like that in our lives, who really believes in us no matter how far-fetched and idealistic or even out of reach our dreams may seem at the time. My grandfather recognized my burning passion for storytelling was actually a gift of God. Beyond that, he himself had been blessed with the gift of the gab, and loved nothing better than to sit around a crackling fire in their beautiful wooden home, with their high ceilings, large hearty open fireplaces, and generous-sized rooms, with breathtakingly beguiling views over the mountains. My grandfather would tell me a really good story, or failing that, he'd read to me from a book he selected from his large library, as like me, he was an impassioned reader, and gobbled up books as hungrily as I did. I think if my grandfather had given it more thought, he might have personally enjoyed becoming a writer himself. So you could say we were like two peas in a pod, in a manner of speaking. But we were both from two completely different generations. But we both got each other. And so in my young life, my grandfather was my biggest cheerleader. I think my father was incredibly irritated with my grandfather for inspiring me to follow my heart. "Why are you telling Missy to become an author?" he would complain. "I don't want her to go down such a miserable, forsaken path. She'll end up living the sequestered life of a hermit, writing books that may never ever be published. Do you realize how soul-destroying that will be for her? As far as I'm concerned, that is no way for a young lady to live. This is not the kind of life I envisage for Missy. I'd thank you kindly to think long and hard before you start filling my daughter's head with all these wistful, unrealistic fancies." "Who says it's a miserable path, Kevin?" my grandfather would interject. "Being a writer does not necessarily mean Missy will live like a hermit. Where on earth did you get that strange, idiosyncratic idea from? Even if she never gets published, does it actually matter? She's still doing something she loves. Surely that's what every father wants for their children. Above anything else, for them to be following their passions. I know people who paint landscapes because they love painting. It brings them joy. Their work is never sold in galleries. But you know what? They're doing what they love. If we want to live a fulfilled life, we need to follow our hearts, pursue our passions, because that's what we're supposed to be doing. I've learnt this in my advancing age, you know. Furthermore, it is not something we can personally choose. It's ingrained within our psyche as human beings, is it not? To do what brings us the greatest pleasure and fulfillment. It's what we're here on this earth for. We're all uniquely individualistic. What fuels one person's interest might drive another away. "Well, I love woodwork, don't I?" said my father. "But I work as an engineer, full-time. And why do I do that? Because it brings money to the table. I cannot afford to spend long, lonely hours getting stuck into my favourite hobby. I would like to remind you, Dad, that some of us, we have to work for a living. Do you think the man at the burger bar enjoys flipping burgers? Or the cleaner enjoys picking up your dirty laundry after you? I don't think so. But they do it. Why do they do it? For the money. Because at the end of the day we need to make a living. And that often involves doing things we might hate. It involves sacrifice. That's what I don't understand about you, Kevin. You're always following the money trail, aren't you? That is not always the answer for every person. Do what you love, for God's sake, and the money will follow. Trust me on this one. If you want to become a carpenter full-time, there is no reason why it cannot be profitable for you to do so. You could start your own furniture shop. Do what you love, for God's sake, Kevin. We only live once. You don't get it, do you, Dad? Life isn't as simple, as straightforward as it was in your day. Besides, I don't mind my job as an engineer. It pays a lot better than being a carpenter, let me tell you. Me and the wife, we want to travel the world. Making money is a way of accomplishing our goals to do just that. There are so many places we are eager to visit. Well, there you go, son.
Travelling is important to you. So you're making the money you need to achieve your goal. That's an accomplishment. It's following your dream, in a manner of speaking. Dad, I get where you're going with this, but you fail to appreciate what I'm really trying to tell you, that being an author is not the right choice for Missy. I want something a whole lot better for her. I want her to get married one day, have children, and if she wants to become an English teacher or to write articles for magazines, by all means she can do that, with the greatest of pleasure. Indeed, I would be the first to encourage her and say, you go, girl. But I'm sorry. Writing books, that's too much for her to take on. And what if she becomes a mother one day? Writing books is all-consuming. It takes over your life. It robs you of quality time you can spend with your own family. Kevin, my grandfather would say, have you not heard a word I've been trying to say to you? If Missy wants to be a writer one day, you are never going to be able to stop her doing what she wants. That's the whole point of what I've been trying to tell you all along. What you seem to fail to appreciate is you cannot live under your daughter's shadow, nor can you live your life vicariously through her, even if you would like to do so. Many well-meaning parents feel just like you do. They want to dictate the course of their children's lives. They disingenuously believe they know better, but you cannot make someone do what they don't want to do. What you want for Missy's life may not be what she wants for her life. You cannot impose your will on your child. She will resent you for that. It's no different from planting a plant in conditions that are unfavourable for it. It'll kill the plant. We all need the right environment to thrive, and Missy's world is all about books. I don't think what you say necessarily is true, said my father. Parents are supposed to guide their children to make better choices for themselves. Sometimes parents do know better. I'm sorry, but they do. And I know better for Missy. We have experience on our side, wisdom too. We know how the world works, and the world can be a very unfair place. What kind of a life can a writer expect to have? Except a solitary, very lonely one. Here we go again, Kevin. Around and around the mulberry bush. Where do you get these preposterous ideas about authors from? You think they're all hermits, don't you? I'd like to remind you that many authors are happily married with children, and they still pursue their passion. Why don't you want the same for Missy? I don't understand you at times, Kevin. I really don't. I remember my father tirelessly arguing with my grandfather at great length about this contentious issue. In the end, I think they agreed to disagree. But my father was hell-bent throughout my childhood in knocking this whimsical, fanciful idea of mine, of becoming an author, right out of my head. But his efforts, as my grandfather had warned him, were completely futile. It was rather like trying to ask a dog to become vegetarian. Try putting lettuce in a dog's bowl, forcing him to eat it. It's never going to happen, as a dog is not hardwired to eat lettuce, although for digestive issues, dogs have been known to chew on grass, and I will concede to that. My grandfather was the one that would take me under the canopy of the night sky when I stayed at their charming home in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He would point up at the Milky Way and the endless collection of bright glittering stars that gilded the night sky with their pomp and ceremony. Those stars, he would tell me, are like people's dreams. There are so many of them. You can pick one out, Missy, whichever one you want, tailor-made especially for you, so that it fits you perfectly, like an evening gown that has been made especially for you to measure. You can have anything you want in your life, Missy, he would tell me. But there is only one catch. You must believe in your dreams. Do you believe, Missy? I believe, I told my Gramps. I believe, Gramps, that I'm going to write books one day. I'm going to be a published author, and I don't care what my dad and mum say about it, 'cause they don't understand. But I'm going to take people on journeys with my stories, Gramps, so they don't have to leave their houses. They can go out on a big adventure with me. They can ride on the back of my words, like an adventure ride on a playground. I mean, you can't get better escapism than that, can you, Gramps? You took the very words right out of my head, little missy. Very well put indeed. There is no greater escapism than a story. Life is hard enough as it is. Sometimes we really need to leave the heedlessly mundane behind us. And words, they can do that for us, can't they? Words have great power to take us on a wild adventure that we can experience through all our senses. I think it's perfectly wonderful that you want to write for a living, missy, he would tell me. Nothing in this world is more satisfying, more uplifting than a jolly good story. This generation, you know, often falsely believe that previous generations like mine, that did not have television, must have been bored out of their skulls. But they're very wrong about that, you know. We were never ever bored. We had stories to entertain us. And those stories far exceeded some of the trash we watch on television today. Let me tell you that, missy. Your Gramps is right, my grandmother would say with a bright twinkle in her eyes. Nothing in this world beats a good story. When I was growing up, missy, me and my sisters would live on stories. We didn't have television in those days, as your grandfather was saying. So stories were our greatest form of entertainment. And every night, until late in our teens, our fathers would tell us stories every single night without fail, before we retired to bed. When television first came out, I really thought it would be so much better than all the storytelling, that it would be a game changer for us. But it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, you know. In the beginning it was a novelty. Of course it was, owning a television. We believed it would transform our lives quite miraculously. But when I stopped to really think about it, it never ever came close to matching the pleasure we received from my father's storytelling. Never close, not even for a moment. Do you know, missy, sometimes the old ways are actually the very best, the most reliable. I still haven't forgotten the many stories my father would tell us when I was a little girl. Much like your grandfather, my father knew how to tell a really good story that would get your pulse racing and your breath tightly squeezed in your lungs. On both sides of the family, we come from a long line of storytellers. So it does boggle my mind, missy, that both your parents do not understand your eagerness to become a writer, to tell your own stories for people to enjoy one day. My grandparents lived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a spectacularly beautiful part of the world, in a stunning wooden home that in many ways resembled a rather grandiose-looking Swiss chalet, which possessed prepossessing views over the mountains. What could be more breathtaking than that? My grandfather had built this house from scratch, out of a design he'd drawn up when he was a young 12-year-old boy. He drew the design on a scrap of paper that he kept for many years and stashed under the floorboards. He'd look at that drawing every single day until the paper disintegrated in his hands, as he'd looked at it so much. From that young, tender age, my grandfather envisaged owning his own home. He had grown up in impoverished circumstances. He wanted to break free from the poverty mindset by believing in something bigger and better for himself and his future. By the time my grandfather was 21, he had already become a landowner and had set to work in building a home that even by modern-day standards was way ahead of its time. With my grandfather's own blood and sweat and tears, he skillfully built his entire house from scratch, with some help, of course, from his brothers and his father, long before he even met my grandmother, and even before my father was born. My grandfather later ended up making a living, a very substantial one at that, with his ingeniously masterful designs. He began to build mountain homes for people. He was incredibly skilled at using his hands.
and began to run a professional business concern with his brothers for several years. And this he did without any college or university degrees behind him. He was completely self-taught. My grandfather lifted his family out of poverty, transforming their lives, because he was such a visionary. It was at 12 years of age, after he'd drawn up his masterful plan for a home on a piece of paper, that he began to work for a local farmer in the area. He had told Farmer Elvin that he would work for him for 10 long years without any payment, on one condition only, that Farmer Elvin in return would give him a large piece of his redundant, heavily wooded land at the back of his property that he never ever used. The farmer thought it was a good deal, after some reflective persuasion, and after he realized my grandfather had become an indispensable, invaluable asset to his ranch. When my grandfather was 21, true to his word, the farmer gave my grandfather the land he had bequeathed him. My grandfather used to live by the age-old adage, "Where there's a will, there is almost certainly a way. And if you really want something enough, missy, if you believe in it, it will be yours." During the school holidays, both my parents would send me to stay with my grandparents. My mother worked full-time as a receptionist for a dental surgery in New York. I think she enjoyed the job to an extent, but her main reason for working was to raise as much money as possible in order to pursue her dreams. Money was the gateway to accomplishing those. My parents were passionate about travel. They were desirous to circumnavigate the globe, and you needed money, and a lot of it, to be able to do that. They were ambitious travellers, jet-setters you could say, for their generation, and were the most well-travelled people I knew. When my parents both took time off work for their holidays, they preferred to shoot off to all kinds of exotic, very fascinating locations abroad. They visited so many spectacular places all around the globe, not all of them glamorous, to remote, faraway destinations. My mother would point to an obscure, faraway place on the globe that you have likely never ever heard of before, and say, "Let's go there, shall we?" And that's what they would invariably do. It became like a game to them, with gainful rewards and indelible memories. I was naturally excluded from these intrepid adventures, and was probably only a passing afterthought. It was not that my parents didn't want me around. Of course they did. But I'm most sure that on some of these overseas excursions, a young child would likely have got in their way and under their feet. So taking me along would have almost certainly complicated things, and I fully understood that. It was certainly easier for them to send me away to stay with my grandparents, who were only too thrilled to take me under their wings. I was incredibly close to my grandfather, who was the only person in my entire life that really understood the way I thought. My grandfather on a cold winter's night, by an open fire crackling away merrily in the huge fireplace in the cosy living room, would read to me, tell me a story. I'd sit there with wide, earnest eyes, hanging on to his every single word. For a long time, I believed that only good stories in life were conjured up by the imaginations of great authors, or people like my grandfather, who knew how to spin a really good yarn. I was later to learn that some of the greatest, most incredible stories can indeed be real, and that the world as we know it is a whole lot more mysterious and enigmatic than we could have ever envisaged. I would never have believed this, of course, until some rather bizarre, cryptic things happened to me when I was staying with my grandparents. Stuff that I'm about to tell you about now. I sometimes wonder if it was the universe's way, a humorous way of saying, "You've got me wrong. I'm a hell of a lot more fascinating and mysterious than you give me credit for." All these years later, some of my own personal experiences have almost certainly inspired some of my fictional writing. For indeed, out of the works of great fiction lie buried many empowering truths, and much of what is written about in fiction was probably birthed from a real-life story in the first place, which leads me to conclude that maybe fiction is not sourced from our imaginations after all, but it almost certainly happened at some place and in some time to somebody on this earth. On many mornings my grandfather would go fishing at the creek in the woods,
Sometimes we would eat the fish he had skillfully caught for dinner. My grandmother would bake the fish in the oven. It would be lovingly wrapped in foil, served with lemongrass and vegetables. It would melt in the mouth like butter. It was so different from the fish my mother bought at the market in New York that in my opinion always tasted rather fishy, which was something I could never understand at the time. The fish my grandmother cooked was flaky and buttery. It was so fresh, and that was why it was like that. That was the quintessential difference. A fish that tastes fishy is probably not that fresh after all. Sometimes I would go fishing with my grandfather on these early morning jaunts, and other times I'd stay behind at the house to help my grandmother in the kitchen, as I thoroughly enjoyed baking, and I had an unquenchable sweet tooth. On this particular morning I was helping my grandmother bake her world-famous lemon chiffon cake, and to date I have never ever eaten a cake that tasted halfway as good. You only had to mention the word lemon chiffon cake, and my grandfather would abandon everything he was doing in a hurry just to have a slice of his favourite cake.
Because even in his own words, he would say that my grandmother's lemon chiffon cake was pretty much as close to heaven as you could possibly get, without having to die first. In my grandfather's mind, if the pearly gates were made out of my grandmother's lemon chiffon cake, then heaven would be a very welcome place indeed. On this morning I'd helped my grandmother carefully mix the ingredients together in the bowl. I had sat on the doorstep, licking out the bowl, savouring the delicious sweet lemony taste of the batter. I had watched the cake rising through the glass door of the oven, and waited somewhat impatiently for about 25 minutes or so, until my grandmother had opened the oven door to inspect the cake. She'd insert a wooden stick into the cake, and when it came out clean, it was as good as ready. I would watch her remove the cake from the oven with her oven gloves. The kitchen would be flooded with the mouth-watering, irresistible caramel-like smells of lemon mingled with butter and sugar. My grandmother popped 2 halves of the cake onto a wire rack, and would look at me with a twinkle in her eyes. "Missy, go and get your grandfather, will you? Tell him I've got his favourite cake for tea." "Are we going to have some lemon chiffon cake now?" I would ask her, unable to disguise the enthusiastic excitement in my voice, as the thought of eating my grandmother's lemon chiffon cake was making me drool like a dog over his bone. "But of course, dear. Nothing tastes better than a cake freshly baked and warm out of the oven." My grandmother must have chuckled as I bolted out of the kitchen and ran across the flowery meadow, buffeted in the furthest distance by the smouldering silhouettes of the Rubenesque Blue Ridge Mountains that confiscated the skyline with their sculptural repose. On this morning the mountains were shrouded by a burgeoning white mist that gave them a mysterious, almost ethereal quality. I hurriedly ran towards the trees. I'm sure my grandmother was probably watching me from the kitchen window, and continuing to chuckle at my expense, as it wouldn't have been hard for her to see the level of ebullience I exerted as I shot through the trees like a bullet that had been discharged with a very straight trajectory. I couldn't wait to get my teeth into that warm lemon chiffon cake that was awaiting me back in the kitchen, soon to be served with rich dollops of double-thick vanilla cream and freshly sliced strawberries. It was not long before I was in the heart of the wood grove, exhaustively running down the familiar path, bespeckled with leaf litter from the previous fall, that was fast turning into a rich, black, densely fertile marsh. There was a cool breeze blowing against my cheeks, as my eager shoes beat the ground, while my breathing became ragged as my pace increased. The morning sun peeked mischievously through the leafy green canopy above my head, dappling the floor in dancing prisms of beguiling light. Everything was terribly pretty. The green shoots of recovery had hijacked the brown bleached remnants of the past very cold, austere winter. Pretty little flowers bobbed their bright little heads through the ground, freckling the grassland. The wood grove was full of bright colours, rich green foliage, and rambling wild berries that grew among the scattered thorny briars. "That's funny," I thought, stopping in my tracks. I had heard the familiar sound of my grandfather's heavy boots thumping the ground. He was moving in the opposite direction to the creek, which was decidedly odd. But then again, I decided that my grandfather must have abandoned his fishing.
He might have got discouraged if the fish weren't biting and taken a casual stroll in the woods instead. I knew he thoroughly enjoyed walking in the woods. It was lucky I'd heard him. I'd be able to catch up with him now, instead of make a wasted trip to the creek, where I'd likely find he'd only just abandoned his fishing tackle. I began to run after my grandfather. I was too out of breath to call his name, but I called out to him when I saw a brief flash of his very distinctive red plaid shirt in the distance. "Gramps!" I called. "Gramps!" But he failed to answer my calls, and as far as I knew, he was never hard of hearing. Why did he seem to be willfully ignoring me? Or was it that the wind had drowned out my voice? I decided the latter must be the case, for my grandfather would never ever ignore me. My grandfather always wore a red or brown plaid shirt when he went fishing, especially if the weather was slightly on the cool side. So I was in absolutely no doubt that the man in the red plaid shirt had to be him. I mean, who else could it be, walking through the trees on his property? So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of the story. It's a very, very exciting story, and I look forward to you joining me tomorrow night. You're really going to love this. So until next time, goodbye and good night.